Printing. Whenever I talk to anyone about Citrix Metaframe, one of the biggest challenges administrators have faced in the past is printing. As with everything else we've talked about so far, printing is configured in the Citrix Management Console. On the left-hand side of the CMC, we can see that we do have a printer management option. If we expand printer management, we have two sub-options, drivers and printers. Now if we click on drivers, we can see that we do have a couple of default drivers already installed. Okay, so let's say we're going to be installing a new printer tomorrow and we need to let our Citrix users be able to print to this new printer. Now the first thing we can do is to install the driver. Now it's important to understand that we don't actually install the driver through Citrix, but through our normal Windows printer tool. So I'll click on Start, Control Panel, and then it will double click on the Printers and Faxes folder. And then we'll come over here to the File menu and then we'll select Server Properties. Now on the Drivers tab, we'll come down here and choose Add, which starts up the Add Printer Driver wizard. So we'll click Next. And now we need to locate our new printer. So what we'll do is we'll scroll down and we'll choose a Hewlett-Packard, and let's just say we'll choose a Hewlett-Packard 5SI. And we'll choose Next. And then we need to select which sort of operating system we're going to be installing these drivers for. Now the default here is Windows 2000, XP and Server 2003. But why don't we add in the driver for NT4 as well, as we might have some legacy systems floating around. So we'll click on Next and we're finished. Now make sure you do have your Windows 2003 CD-ROM in your CD drive because you may require some files from it. Okay, that we're done now, so we'll click Close. Now back in our Citrix Management Console, we can see that the HP LaserJet 5SI printer driver has been installed. Now technically this means that users can print to our 5SI. Now the problem is, if we had multiple Citrix Metaframe servers, then these additional servers won't have the driver installed, so we're going to run into some problems. So the solution to this is to replicate this driver we've just installed to any additional servers in our farm. So if we right click on the 5SI printer driver, we've got a couple of options. The first option we have here is to replicate drivers. Now when we click this, we actually get a message which kind of sounds a little bit of a dire warning message, telling us that we might have problems if we do this and it's a potentially dangerous operation, but we'll just select yes. And now we have the option of replicating this HP LaserJet 5SI driver to all of our Metaframe servers in a farm, which are currently running the same platform as this server, which is Windows Server 2003. Now this is the default option. Or we can choose to replicate just to a specific server or specific servers, and then we just select these servers from the list, and then at the bottom we could also choose to overwrite any drivers that we have for the 5SI that might already exist on our target Metaframe servers. Now this is quite useful if we do want to update an older driver with a new one. So if we're done, we just click on OK, and then replication will be queued up to occur. Now the second method of replication is auto replication. So what we'll do is we'll right click again and then we'll select auto replication. Now this option will automatically replicate drivers from the source server where it's installed, so in other words this server, to all other Metaframe servers that are running on the same platform, which again in our case is Windows Server 2003. So to add a new driver to be replicated, we'll click on Add, and then we locate the driver from the list that we see here. We'll choose our HP 5SI. Now over here on the right you can see that the selected driver is currently installed on these servers that are in this list, of course, which we only have one, Server 01. Again, we have the option down here to overwrite any existing drivers, and I'll choose that option, and then we'll click OK, and then we'll click Yes. And now we can see our HP LaserJet 5SI driver has been included in our list for replication, and of course we're going to overwrite any existing drivers that may exist on the target server. So we'll click on OK, and then we can see that our replication operation now has been queued, and then when we've got a spare moment, this will actually be processed. So then we'll just click on OK to get rid of that message. Alright, so we've seen the drivers, but now let's take a look at the printers. Now we actually don't have a printer installed on this server, but that's okay because we can actually add one anyway. So what we'll do now is we'll click on Start, Control Panel, and then we'll click on Printers and Faxes, and now we'll double click on the Add Printer wizard. We'll choose Next. Now I'll uncheck to automatically detect my printer because the printer doesn't exist, and we'll just choose a local printer attached to this computer, and of course we'll choose Next. Now we'll leave the default here as LTP1 and we'll choose Next. And now we need to specify what sort of printer we have. So again, why don't we go down and use the same printer that we just configured with the driver, which is the, here we go, the HP LaserJet 5SI, and we'll choose next. And we can see we already have an existing driver, or do we want to use a new one? Well, we'll keep the existing driver, there's no point installing it again. And now we need to give our printer a name. We'll just accept the default and we'll choose next. And do we want to share this printer? Well, why not? Well, I'll just call this one HP 5SI for the sake of being easy, and then we'll choose next. And then we can provide some location information if we like. Okay, so I've just populated some information. We have a location of the second floor in our east building and a comment that this is our sales report printer. So I'll choose next. Do we want to print a test page? No, we don't, so we'll choose next. Okay, and we're complete. Okay, now that our printer's been added to our server, we need to tell Citrix Metaframe about it. So what we'll do is we'll right click on Printer Management and then we'll select Update Printer and Driver Information. Now we'll come over here to the Printers tab and we can see that our HP 5SI has now been added to our Citrix Metaframe server. So let's move on and let's take a look at the process of auto-creating printers. Now that we actually have a local printer installed, we can use auto-creation to automatically make a locally attached printer available for use in a Citrix ICA session. Now the first thing we need to do for auto-creation to occur is to install the printer driver on both the server and the client. Now in our case, when we installed the HP LaserJet 5SI driver on our Metaframe server, it also happens to be the client in our case, so we've already done that. But when you have a local printer attached to a workstation, it's logical to assume that you've already installed the printer driver locally in order for you to be able to print to that device. Now in that situation, you would then need to come in and add the driver to your Metaframe XP server using the steps that we did earlier when we installed the 5SI driver. The next requirement of auto creation is printer mappings. Because printer manufacturers often use different names to describe their printer drivers, Citrix uses printer mappings to ensure that whatever the client calls the driver is mapped to match whatever the server calls the driver. Now generally speaking, drivers that are written for NT and above are normally fine, but older legacy Windows clients like 95 or 98 can often cause some problems. So if we come over here and we right click on drivers, we have the mappings option. Now currently we don't actually have any mappings defined, but we could easily change that. So let's assume for a moment that we have a Windows 98 client that wants to use our HP LaserJet 5SI printer. Now the driver is defined on our Windows 2003 server as HP LaserJet 5SI, but on a Windows 98 machine it might be defined as HP LaserJet 5SI/MX. So let's just create a mapping by clicking on Add. And now we can enter in the client driver name and then the corresponding server driver name. So here we've entered in a fictitious example, whereas our Windows 98 client uses the driver name of HP LaserJet 5SI/MX, and of course our Windows 2003 server uses HP LaserJet 5 with a capital S and a lowercase I. So once we've provided those printer mappings, we can then just click OK, and we can see our printer mappings now been defined here in our window. So now what's going to happen is when a legacy client like Windows 98 uses auto creation to create a printer, it'll map to the server driver over here, and thus it'll prevent any printer problems. Now the final thing we need to do for auto creation to occur is to replicate our printer driver to all of the Metaframe XP servers as we showed earlier. And that's basically it. So what we'll do is we'll click on OK, and we'll just close out of this for a moment, and we'll click on our ICA file to launch our desktop. Now I'll just enter in my administrator details and my password, and we'll click on enter. Okay, so here we are within our desktop session. Now in a desktop session we can easily identify an auto-created local printer by its name. So if we open an application such as Notepad, and then we'll select File and Print, we can see over here that we do actually have the HP LaserJet 5SI listed as client/server01 with a £, followed by the name of the printer. Now under the comments here we can see an auto-created client printer on server 01. Okay, so we'll just close this down here for the moment. We'll go back to our management console. Now the last thing we should look at regarding auto creation is the users or groups that will be able to automatically use our created printer. So if we right click on our printer and we select auto creation, we can then locate a user or group. So what I'll do, and we've seen this before, is I'll double click on my testdomain.com domain. We'll scroll down and we'll select our users OU. And then I'll click over here on the show users. Now, of course, normally you would do this assigned to groups, but in our demonstration, we'll just use our administrator account. And then we'll select add, and we can see that our administrator account is down here in our list of configured accounts. Now, one other thing we've got here is our printing preferences, and this just enables us to set our default paper size, the number of copies that we would have, the print quality, and what sort of paper orientation that we're going to have for our printer. So we'll just leave those defaults there and we'll click on OK, and now our administrator account can use our HP 5SI. Okay, so that's all done, too easy. Now let's go and take a look at the properties of our printer management, as there's a few options there that you should definitely be aware of. So to view the properties, we'll simply right click on our printer management and then we'll select properties. Now we've got two options up here on the left hand side, and they're to configure the properties of the drivers and of the printers. Now with the drivers option, we have 4 other printer driver options to choose from when we're dealing with drivers that are used for automatically created printers. Now we could use our native drivers only, and they're the drivers that we physically installed for the printer like we did when we installed the HP LaserJet 5SI. Then we have universal drivers. Now universal drivers, which are included in Citrix Metaframe XP, are a very generic PCL4 print driver that's been stripped of any features. So having this default driver available saves you from having to install print drivers for different devices on the Metaframe XP servers. The PCL4 driver generates the print jobs in PCL4 format and then passes the jobs to the local machine for processing. And then this local machine would use its locally installed print driver to output the print job. Now this just means that the universal print driver can be used with practically any printer, because if you're able to print to your local printer outside of your ICA session, then you should be able to print through it using the Citrix universal print driver. Now next we have the default option, which is to use our universal driver only if our native drivers aren't available. And then finally we have the option to use both of them. Now at the bottom we have the option of automatically installing our native drivers for any automatically created client and network printers. Now the next option we have up here is the printers option, and here we have 2 categories. Categories for automatically created client printers and automatically created network printers. With regards to the automatically created client printers, I won't go through all of these as they're fairly self-explanatory, but the default here is to automatically create client printers when the user logs on. We could also update the properties at each logon. We do inherit by default the client's printer setting for keeping their printed documents, and we have some other options for deleting pending print jobs at logout. Actually, this option here is really useful because if a user logs out and a print job happens to error, then this pending job can hold up everyone else's print jobs. So this is actually quite a good option to check. Now when we do automatically create the client print device, the default is to use the connection setting from each server. So before we wrap up our discussion of printing, it's important that we run through a few basic troubleshooting steps. And keep in mind as we discuss troubleshooting printing in Metaframe XP that a great deal of printing problems in a Metaframe XP environment are not Metaframe's problem, but generally related to Windows itself. So with that in mind, let's look at troubleshooting the common Windows problems. Now at this point I'll assume that the most obvious troubleshooting steps have already been performed, and here I'm talking about making sure that paper's in the printer and that it's online and it has toner and so on and so forth. Now one of the first things you should do is check the disk space on the drive that the spooler service uses to store its temporary files, because if there's no disk space left, then there's no printing. It's as simple as that. Now if there is space, check the spooler service and if necessary, restart it. So to restart the spooler service, we'll come down here and we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll select the Services MMC. Then what we'll do is we'll scroll down, we'll locate the print spooler, and then we can simply come over here and then click Restart, or of course we could right click and select Restart as well. Now, if you happen to be a command line junkie, you can open up a command prompt and then you can type in net stop spooler and then followed by net start spooler. Now if this doesn't solve your problem, check the Windows application event log for any error messages that might identify the cause of your problem. Now as far as Citrix printing problems goes, the most common printing problem you're likely to encounter is when a local client printer is not automatically created. So the first thing you should do is open up the Citrix connection configuration by clicking on Start, All Programs, Citrix, Metaframe XP, and then selecting Citrix Connection Configuration. Now we need to double click on our ICA TCP protocol, and then we'll come down here and we'll click on the Client Settings button. And then we just come over here and check that the Disable Windows Client Printer Mapping and Disable Client LTP Port Mapping are not checked. Okay, with that out of the way, the next thing we should do is to confirm that our client and server drivers match. If they don't, then you'll need to go and create a printer driver mapping like we discussed earlier. Finally, confirm that the client's name is unique, as the client name is used in the auto creation of the printer. So if the name is not unique, the attempt to create the printer will fail. So as you've learnt in this video, printing within a Metaframe environment is a complex process, but thankfully the Citrix Management Console eases some of the burdens that existed back in the Metaframe 1.8 days. Make sure you familiarise yourself with the auto printer creation process and the driver replication process, as both will save you a lot of time and a lot of heartache down the track.